I think I'm going to have a very quick bathroom visit. I'll be back in the.
Oh, thanks for that.
I'm just gonna send this article now so I don't forget.
Great. All right. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're based in the world. It is now 3 minutes to 4 here in Hamburg, Germany. So we'll just give it a few more minutes for Henri to come back and us to get ready, grab yourself a cup of tea, and then I'm looking forward towards this conversation with Alan and Henri. Great. Henri, good to have you back. I just said it's now 3 minutes before 4, so I think we'll give it a couple more minutes before we kick it off, and we'll take it from there. Okay, I think it's pretty much 4 o'clock where I am at least. And I think we should start it. A wonderful good afternoon, good morning, good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today on this conversation between a good old friend Henri and a new friend Alan. We're talking a little bit more substantial today about beyond grants and beyond those good intentions. Really, what are we doing here? And I'm letting Henri and Alan introduce themselves. Just a bit of housekeeping before we kick it off. This webinar is recorded. My colleagues will share that on the various channels a couple of days or even hours later. There's also subtitles available for anybody who needs to get beyond my very German accent and try to follow that. And lastly, there's a Q&A session already open. I've got a few topics I really like to pick Alan's and Henri's brains on, but by all means, feel free to add questions. This is not a death by PowerPoint webinar, but rather a fundamental conversation, more podcast-like, to be honest. I've got 2 or 3 presentation slides only, then we'll shut those down and highlight whoever is speaking. And without much further ado, I'd like to ask my panelists here, Henri and Alan, to introduce themselves because they can do this much better than I can. Alan, would you like to start?
Thanks, Chris. And really a pleasure to be here having this conversation today. I am Ellen Brooks, the Director of Innovative Finance at the International Rescue Committee, which is a humanitarian NGO. This is a role I've had for over 4 years, and I joined the IRC from JP Morgan Asset Management.
Fantastic. Alan, and you are based in?
New York, but also, as we say, on a plane.
As on a plane, indeed. Thanks for being here again, Alan. I found our previous conversations extremely interesting. You have a way of getting to the point. So thanks again for joining this little talk here again. Henri, you are also mostly based on a plane, but right now you are back home in Amsterdam. Is that right?
Yes, I'm in Amsterdam, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and it's so timely actually to have the conversation. So very thankful for that. It's very timely for the organization that I'm privileged to run at the moment. It's a New Energy Nexus. We are an organization which is active in using entrepreneurs as a change agent for climate change and making the energy transition in both developing and developed worlds.
Fantastic. Henri and Alan, you are both seasoned leaders very much in the development aid and humanitarian space. And let me start off with this. The space with the sector in which we stand, in which we work, that stands at a crossroad, really.
There are major powers like the US, for example, but other ones as well, who are retreating from their traditional roles and responsibilities. They're showing their unwillingness to take on the responsibilities of building a more just, fairer, and more inclusive world. And that leaves aid organizations navigating really seismic shifts in funding, but also purpose and legitimacy. And the system, as we all know, and I know I've partially discussed it with you before, has been long overdue a reform and a change. And it faces some pretty urgent questions right now. Questions like, can we fundamentally rethink aid to empower local communities genuinely? That is a conversation I really would like to have. Is financial sustainability available through new models like impact investment? Are we getting there? Alan, I'm sure you have a view on that, and I would love to hear about that. And crucially, as these governments step back from the global commitments to the SDGs and the climate justice, how must we as NGO leaders, as social entrepreneurs and charities step forward? Is there a role for us, and how does this change? And that's sort of what I'd love to unpack today. And diving straight in, let me just shut down the slides because we may as well talk it like this. Stepping right in, I'd like to start, Henri, with your board meeting today, with your work for a long time on localization, and want to ask a semi-critical question on a sort of localization reality check. You lead an organization that works in a lot of countries, and despite years of rhetoric, which you and I have witnessed about empowering local actors, it seems still somewhat elusive. What barriers sort of do you see for us to actually have to dismantle, to be genuine about this?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I would start by saying the old world, as we might call it, was not necessarily a bad world. It's not like it was old like this and we must change. Yes, change is sort of natural to us as human beings. But let's not forget that ODA, that what has been happening in the past has helped eradicate diseases.
Yes.
It has helped to reach out in a humanitarian fashion, which humanity hasn't done before in centuries earlier. And even when you connect trade and development aid, it's good to remember that for the US, for instance, 11 of the top 15 trading partners of the US actually were recipients of development assistance.
Yeah.
So it's sort of good to sort of realize that that is there too, and that there is a great need as organizations are now scrambling and trying to find a way forward. But at the same time, I think already for some years we've been talking about decentralization, empowerment of local organizations, and so on. And I think both from the funders' perspective and also from many INGOs and NGOs, that's been a very difficult path to walk. It's been a lot of talk, and there's been some empowerment in terms of programming, but in terms of real empowerment of actually setting the strategic direction and actually really having a real say over resources, over sources of funding, then suddenly you see it changes. But some changes have happened. I worked for a larger INGO, and when I came in, probably about 8 years ago or so, most countries were being led by expats.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's changed.
Mm-hmm.
We realize that local leadership is actually tremendously strong, but the real move to empowerment, of letting go, of moving from the power of ownership to the power of mission, is one we find really, really complex to actually do. And it sort of comes from our old colonial capitalist models that find us very difficult to change things that we have got addicted to, our systems and our way of running it. So it's not easy. It requires a real behavior change. It's not just, oh, we'll redesign a few processes. It really requires an incredible amount of self-reflection to actually look at what is my role and how do I behave within the system and how can that change and how should it change?
You said a lot of that, which I absolutely agree with. First of all, I liked that you mentioned that a lot of it does work. We shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater here. I completely agree. And for the avoidance of doubt, the retreat of the US from development aid is obviously done in this anti-wokery way. It doesn't actually stand up to rational arguments. So there's a lot that did work. I appreciate that. But you and I have been in situations where, or I certainly have been in situations where I got the distinct sense that the behavior change necessary to really go from ownership to stewardship, to really give up control and ultimately deal with resource management, cash management differently, is a hard nut to crack. And Alan, I'd love to hear from you on this one. How do we transition here? Is that something that is now more urgent with all the changes happening? Maybe you got some insight there.
Just to say, I mean, I fully agree. I think to frame my response, we are sitting well into the 21st century using tools of both economic measurement and growth, capital markets, capitalism in general, that were designed for a different era. It was an era of no technology, in the sense of we didn't have personal computers in our pockets. It was the sense of the world was not interconnected with the click of a button. We've been witnessing over the past couple of decades, like the technological shifts and leaps and access to information that the rest of the world has that used to be concentrated in places of power, and especially in the global north. And so all of the systems that were designed, as Henri said very correctly, around the idea of colonialism and imperialism and controlling power and resources for, growth of certain populations. And that has broken apart with the decolonization of Africa, but you still look at Africa as being colonized by multinational corporations that are refusing to give up the resources that are technically within those national borders. So we haven't really moved away from that mindset. And I even see that inside an international NGO like the one I sit in, where we operate in 40 at any given time with the crisis situation, 40 to 50 countries around the world. Those country programs are incredibly localized. Most of them are, at this point, national staff, highly skilled national staff that know the communities that they're serving, know the solutions that they have to deliver, but they are only enabled to a certain point to make strategic decisions about the country programs because of the funding mechanism, because that funding mechanism still comes in from top down. And I think what we're seeing now is, maybe just to describe that for those who aren't as familiar with the humanitarian sector, the humanitarian sector is fully funded by grants. And this is mostly government grant funding. 85% of all humanitarian aid comes from 11 country government budgets. So that sort of helps reflect the shock factor that the United States pulling back from being a big humanitarian development funder has. That pulls out a part of that funding. But at the same time, USAID was known for being very challenging to work with local partners because of their very complex diligence processes and application processes and proposal processes. We were just doing a proposal, before this all happened, and we had to go through 4 different guidebooks of how to do the proposal that were over 100 pages each. A small local NGO cannot handle that requirement. That is just, it was absurd for us, but literally a small NGO with a small staff who's actually delivering services does not have the time or the capacity to go through that kind of manual process. So with the potential very big funding gap and the systems change that it will force, we do have an opportunity to stop going to those very centralized New York or London or Brussels HQs of these service providers and actually start on the ground and build from the ground up. And that's the work that we've done at IRC Innovative Finance. Is actually, even though I'm originally from New York, I spent most of my career in the Middle East. And so I had a base and an ability to go into the country programs and be welcomed by all of our country programs. And we built all of our innovative finance partnerships from the ground up. So I would interview the country program leadership and different strategy heads and say, what are the needs that the communities you serve are not being met by this traditional grant funding mechanism? And that's how we started going out. We sort of figured out what those needs were, and then we went out to investors who were also working on the ground. And I think that's it sounds very simple, but it's not really the way that work is done. And I think building from the ground up, building from the needs up, and really co-designing from the communities is how we start addressing this. And I would say the call to action to people with capital on the sidelines or funders or philanthropists is to make sure that where your funds go are to those country programs, to those country-led operations, and not being held at the central level of any organization, whether it's a development contractor or a humanitarian NGO.
So Henri, I think we need to get down to the brass metal here, to the practicalities. We all agree on the geopolitical and the historic growth that Henri and you just so succinctly summarized. But we both work in a sector that is financially tied to transferring money from the global north to the global south in order to enable these programs. And these funding origins do not change, however much we like it. There are many areas in which domestic revenue capture is elusive and sometimes even impossible, frankly, for these areas. So what should the role of an international INGO then be? What should the headquarter then confine itself to? What is, if we are not, if we are merely a bank account transferring funding over, I'm obviously talking about extreme cases here, then how should a HQ leader, probably not even calling it HQ, starting with that, but what should a NGO that has a global north financial origin base, you know what I mean? How should we manage that? What behavior change should we be looking at, Henri?
Well, let's start by one size fits all doesn't fit here.
Yeah.
Because the differences between the type of, organizations, whether let's say we talk at SAVE or Mercy Corps, IRC, or an organization like ourselves and so many others. But there are a few who've really broken down barriers. And one example is AMREF, for instance. AMREF, and that's already some years ago. So they've done this way ahead of others. They've literally said, we'll move our headquarters to where we're working instead of where we are getting our funding from. And so they moved to Nairobi, where they have their office today. And those in the north could come along, but of course, working on local salary levels. And they've been extremely successful, even so successful they created their own university, which is running extremely well. And the most they have here in Europe and North America are sort of fundraising teams, because some of the funders haven't moved yet. And so some of the conversations are happening, let's say, in the Northern Hemisphere, but the decision making has moved really to a local level. So that is an example of an organization which has dared to make that step. I think for a number of the larger, and I'm looking at some of the US-based organizations, it's a very complicated situation. They've been used to getting NECRA, indirect cost recovery of up to 30%.
Yeah.
Almost an unrestricted give. And as a result, you've seen offices of some of those INGOs grow really quite large in the US because it just made sense and it was paid for. But if you really looked and did an honest activity-based costing of $1 received and then $1 spent or euro spent, before any beneficiary is touched, 50% is gone already. And that's just how it is.
Yeah.
So does that system need to change, become more effective, more cost effective? For sure. And one of the things, of course, is empower local people. There is so much knowledge on a local level, and that may not be in all fragile states, but in a lot of the developing countries where we are active, it definitely is the case. So look for the right people and localize.
I'm going to challenge us slightly, because we all I'm sure what I'm going to describe is we all experience that, Alan, and I would love to see your view on it. You said IRC is incredibly localized. And Henri, you made a good example of moving headquarters with local staffing down to, in this case, Nairobi, or to anywhere where they're actually working. But we've also, I'm sure you have as well, seen organizations where the headquarters may have moved, but the power still is in the pockets and is sitting in where the money comes from. Sometimes through no bad reason. Sometimes, if you know, Alan, you mentioned in the humanitarian system, it's particularly concentrated. The origin of the funding comes down to a handful of countries. And they, these donors, the taxpayer, have a certain way of doing things. They're not going to fund a certain way of doing things in certain programs. You could not even blame them for it, maybe. Maybe they also have a right to decide what happens. The taxpayer has a right to decide what happens to the taxpayer funds and how they are being used, which ultimately prescribes a programming approach. So your headquarter might be in whichever country you want to. If 90, 80, or even a smaller but significant proportion of your funding comes from a pool of funding, a pot of money that describes and prescribes, sometimes very explicitly, 100 pages procurement books, Alan, you've said it, how you do things. How do you then manage a true power profile? Is that even possible in the grant-based model?
Do you want me to take that? I can
Love to.
say some, I'll just correct or clarify what I said. I actually really wouldn't call IRC decentralized. We have incredible staff at the local level, but I would say the main decisions do come, and it's exactly the phenomenon that Henri described, is this indirect cost recovery, this basically unrestricted portion of every grant that goes to this unrestricted budget that then gets spent in a way, and this is, I'm not speaking about IRC, I'm speaking of the sector in general, but that gets spent in a way that does not have a clear tie to impact on the clients on the ground. And I think this concept, when I joined the IRC from the private sector, I was shocked to hear from my colleagues, again, country colleagues, but telling me the high inefficiency of, money that you donate to UN agencies or otherwise, where a huge portion of every dollar is actually going to pay bureaucratic salaries in the global north, or,
Right.
These very high salaries of expat staff and benefits for expat staff and all that. And that to me was even more shocking when I found out that my friends who work in like investment banks and others in the global south, there isn't the disparity between, a national staff and an international staff. Everybody gets the same salary at the same bank in the same country. And so it's kind of crazy that the humanitarian sector, the NGO world, maybe more in general, still is having these levels of pay when like the private sector doesn't do that anymore either. So I think there's something to be said here for like really readjusting the accounting mechanisms within, and it's not easy. That's an easy advice to give. It's a hard thing to execute on, but tying the accounting mechanisms to actual programmatic impacts and reducing the spend and really the role of Global North and staff to either fundraising, and fundraising, of course, based on returns. So if someone is not bringing in money, they don't get to keep their job, and bureaucratic work. So like getting through those 100-page manuals, if they're still going to exist next year for humanitarian aid, that like bureaucratic, paperwork aspect should be handled by the non-programmers, the non-technical leads, and otherwise.
Yeah. What do you think on it? Can we truly localize in a grant-based model?
Well, I think maybe the grant-based model in its form as it is now needs to be rediscovered and rethought through, and that would take more than today's discussion.
Yeah.
I think the traditional model of request for proposals, this is, for this particular program in particular country, that needs rethinking, because that starting point is often already Nordic based, right? And it's sort of Nordic determined. So that already needs a change. But I would say leave that to another time, is, how do we reimagine how these grant models could be working in a different way. Some countries have been changing around by giving embassies much larger budgets, on a localized basis and have engaged more with local partners, meaning really local partners, not part of an international organization. And some have been quite successful, especially some of the smaller countries who've really empowered their own embassies to work on a local level, have managed to do a pretty decent job actually of localizing the funding with local partners. And they've proven actually that there's some really good local partners. That's as simple as that. And they need to be empowered even further.
So that is a good bridge over to a little bit looking at the financial re-innovation and reimagining. I've been involved in the last 2 years, and I think I don't have the specific data at hand, but in my personal experience, Alan, you might disagree here, please, and if so, please do. The amount of non-grant funding instruments has, I would say, since last summer on my personal inbox, my personal workstation here at my desk, probably tenfold increase. It's a real increase. So other ways. And Henri, I'm picking this up because increasingly some Nordic donors in particular, and even Germany now, which is now the largest donor in the world, shockingly enough, are using grant money not to fully fund a project and then therefore be very prescriptive about it, but are starting to say we're using it to draw in private and guarantees and DFIs, and therefore we accept. I had a conversation with the GIZ just this morning in Southeast Asia, and they said, look, we accept that if we are only investing, in this case, 4 million, instead of running the full program at 44 million, we can't prescribe how things are done. That prescription of how things will then come from the local entrepreneurs, and the DFIs will have something to say about this, and the local government has some certain things. And that's using grant money, in my mind, much smarter, more localized, and actually more effective because it catalyzes a lot of additional investment. So is my question to Alan maybe, the governmental funds here are shrinking, and NGOs have a major challenge here, but also a role to play in that shift out of the grants model that we have sort of just discussed. Is difficult to localize in most scenarios. Can we really shift towards innovative financing, impact investments, without compromising our values, our humanitarian values, and our SDGs? Because suddenly we're talking to investors as well.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and scientifically, I would agree with you. Just from what's come across my desk in the past year, we're seeing a lot more of outcome bonds from actual banks, not the World Bank and development partners, but actual private corporate banks, which was a surprise to me. But that was a movement, and then looking more at results-based financing from donors as well. That's been a movement, and then we're also looking at IRC. I have a white paper I can drop in the chat, but leveraging financial structures like humanitarian debt swaps. So looking at the debt swap for nature conservation that was really piloted by the Nature Conservancy, but changing the use of proceeds for social outcomes, for humanitarian outcomes. So there's a lot more movement. I think this was driven by necessity, but also the fact that there's been a bulk of research. We kind of have proof of concept that there are other ways to operate rather than just in the traditional grant model. It's just that the systems were set up to respond to the traditional grant model. So I think one of the things we've done at IRC is try to think about blended finance. And blended finance just means using multiple portions of financing that have different return-seeking goals in the same structure. So you can use a grant with a loan and combine them together on the same project, and that is blended finance. Almost everything we do at IRC is blended finance because we're combining grant funding with an investment that is being structured by investors. The example I can give of that is our project with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Northern Jordan. This is a blended finance instrument that has grant funding and a loan to the Jordanian government from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development combined, and the grant funding goes towards technical assistance. It's paying IRC to provide technical assistance, as well as the other work around the investment to ensure community engagement and stakeholder strategy and stakeholder goals are met around this very large first-time sewage operation for 15 towns. And so that's, you know, technical assistance, blending grants with investment. That's one way to look at it. If you have access to grants and you want to really capitalize and maximize their impacts for communities, because of course, when you use a grant to improve the reach of a sewage system that is being built for a population that is home to Jordanians and Syrians, that has a much longer term effect than if you're just spending down the grant for a program for those Syrians in that community. So you're wanting to see how you can leverage the grant funding to go a little bit further. But the other piece I would say here is, and this is how we started our work, but this is really the advice I give to any, you know, NGO or impact focused entity is, what is the value of what you provide that is potentially funded only by grants now? And how can you take that value and sell it? And not in a way that you're selling access to vulnerable communities or giving up any of your values. Instead, actually, as a humanitarian or someone who promotes SDGs or an impact-focused investor, you're actually providing like the front line or the last line of defense because you are the impact verifier. And if you are able to value the work that you provide, whether it's you know, education and training programs, whether it's consulting services, whether it's due diligence, whether it's risk mitigation, whether it's, you know, sharing revenue or leasing spaces, identifying the assets that you have. Sometimes there's technology that's been developed that could have IP rights and otherwise. Then you are ensuring that there is actually a sustainability to that impactful work that you are doing by making it revenue based. So what I'm describing is not something that you can do overnight, but I would say that the key thing in moving away from just being reliant on grants is to figure out the intrinsic value and how you can sell that to the development and private sectors.
Alan, sorry, Henri.
Love to add on that, Alan. You know, this is great. And at the same time, let's be honest, at this moment, early stage investment bottlenecks in frontier markets are just largely due to risk. Fragmented ecosystems that are there, very determinants for low demand for investments, low levels of credit worthiness, and small deal sizes. I mean, we're helping entrepreneurs move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Well, the risks are higher. What is the residual value of the battery of an EV, a motorcycle, and so on and so forth? So making it hugely difficult to make that transition. And so I have no doubt that part of the grant money that has been flowing also because we haven't addressed the financial issues that are out there. And so we really need to de-risk it by first loss guarantees. We're working, as we speak, we're working on a first loss guarantee fund for India and for Kenya for EVs, so that local financiers can finance at an interest rate which makes sense for a business plan. But that really needs changing, and blended finance definitely is also one, although it's complicated in the sense that they all often overflow into each other. So how do you keep sort of Chinese walls between the investment part and the grant part? But very important, and concessional capital. So these are really important things that we need to address. Strengthen the role of multilateral development banks more than what they have been able to do as well. So that the whole finance sector is really important. If I may say one more thing.
Absolutely.
And that has to do with the crisis in which we are. It is time to become more effective and efficient. Let funders push harder on organizations to start working together really seriously. It is still not happening. Our industry is highly fragmented, even in today's world. And so we need to dare to actually merge, to start working together, create multi-country programs with multi-country organizations. It's still not happening sufficiently. And maybe this is the time when there is a crisis and organizations are finding the financial burden of survival and so on. It's time to have those deep conversations, and funders can help to push that needle in the right direction.
Interestingly enough, Henri, and this is not confidential, so I'm flying over to the FCDO in London tomorrow to have exactly that conversation. How can we not just pool in additional funding, not just do these de-risking and blended finance methods, but how can we have multi-country staggered programs with a 15-year time horizon, working with other donors, foundations, and set up big programs without becoming too bureaucratic and prescriptive. A 15-year time plan doesn't work. So you'll be pleased to hear that there is some thinking in London happening on that at least. You know, and also very interesting, and people might be interested to hear this, we just secured funding for a South African NGO, and the foundation involved was very interesting. They said, look, we're not going to give you a fixed sum for core funding, but we're going to give you a percentage of all the non-grant funding you pull in, because we appreciate that it's taking a lot of time and de-risking and management of expectations and blending teams and expectations as well. And all that moderation takes time. So as you are succeeding in that, we'll give you a sliding scale core fund to do that. And I thought that was a pretty innovative way of the foundation to think about it. You know, saying we'll take care of the core and you, but it's more results focused, more focused on actual pulling in additional funding. So that's happening slowly. You know, you'll be pleased to hear. Last question, if there are any questions that you want to add, everybody, for the panelists, then please put them in the Q&A. I can't quite follow the chat all the time, so please use the Q&A and we'll get to them. Quick one around the sort of future. Let's look around. We don't have too much time left. Now, given those things we just discussed, given those tectonic shifts we have here, sort of what skills, very personal skills, what mindsets, you know, Henri, you sort of mentioned it, but you didn't really have time to go into this, as sort of what traits would a leader in our sector need to impersonate over the next decade? Ellen, you sort of hinted one as well. I've got a view on that one as well. What style of leadership is required here? Henri, do you want to start on this one?
I'll let Ellen go.
Oh, well, nice.
I already touched on that. It's a great subject, and it's a very important subject because
and we're not going to do it justice in 5 minutes. We have left.
I was going to say,
let's try to dive into it.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a great one, because I think if I can plug the fact that I'm really disappointed in pretty much all global leadership right now for their lack of innovation and forward thinking, as a person who has very little power in the world. I think one of the things I look at, and this is kind of the crux of this webinar, is the need for real partnership. And that is what we have been forced to do at IRC, because we were not able to use our balance sheet. It was a heavily government grant balance sheet, so we were not able to make our own investments at the beginning. So we were forced to partner with investors. That EBRD project I described was our first pilot investment, and that was a partnership that we had to build. And that was extremely difficult. And we have a case study online where we talk about the lessons learned of that. And EBRD has become a tremendous partner to us. And we have both educated one another a lot over the years. But that was something that, you know, seemed really simple to partner between humanitarian and development actors, and in practice becomes very, very challenging. And so I would say the skill is translation that's needed. And we kind of joked at Innovative Finance that we were just translators. My team is a whole team of ex-bankers working now in the humanitarian sector. So we often find ourselves going between the two sectors or the three sectors, whatever, across the nexus, a word that is overused and not actually implemented anywhere. But to say a quote that has come to mind a lot recently is actually from Noah Yuval Harari, the author of Sapiens. He's written a new book called Nexus, which is on human communication networks, and actually how that led to the development of AI and what we think about AI for the future. And he said something very profound in this book, which I think relates to our work and relates to this need for better cooperation and partnership going forward, is that the precursor or precondition for cooperation is not similarity, but ability to communicate. And I think that's something that we don't focus enough on, is that communication across the sectors between different stakeholder groups that can really lead to outcomes that are bigger than the sum of the parts. And that's what we started to try to do at IRC. And we know, and there's a lot of others in the sector who are also benefiting a lot, but it's not easy at the beginning.
And I'm very pleased you're quoting Hariri. He's also a favorite author, I think, of many people, including myself. In an earlier book, he quoted the fact that we consider something along the lines of the fact that we've become successful as a race of people, as humans on this planet. This is what I mean. We became successful by our ability to communicate and to cooperate. We don't have sharp claws, we don't have thick fur, but we do have that, and we can imagine the future. I think I completely agree with you. Being able to paint a picture, communicate of the future that is pragmatic, positive, and has some applicable next steps is incredibly important as a leader. Pure technical skill, I think, is not. And if I may add to that, Alan, I've personally experienced in the last 3 years that, or 2 years, I've reflected with this on a friend recently, where I said, look, really what I am these days is a modem. A communication modem. That's pretty much 80% of my work. I think the technical skills I studied at university are no longer that relevant anymore, or at least not that much in demand. Henri, you are also a leader. You've led several organizations. Final word as we're approaching the deadline. What would you say to sort of personal leaders and the upcoming generation? What skills do they need to embody and behaviors they need to probably embrace?
Well, I think one thing is we actually need to reimagine the future. We are in a crisis of sorts, and it is not just in the northern countries. It is felt everywhere, and I could see it just getting off a leadership meeting this afternoon with our leaders from across the world. So we must take that opportunity. That means reflection. That means also standing still, just not jumping into the next thing, but actually standing still for a moment and actually saying, what is happening out there? Where is the world where we're coming from? We talked about our dysfunctional capitalist system and our addiction to it. So how do you get rid of an addiction? Well, I used to smoke when I was young. It took me some time to get off it, but I'm really happy that I did. But there are some addictions that I need to get off, and that's going to take some time. For me personally, it has really meant from moving from this sort of action-oriented, efficient, effectiveness, and so on, to becoming a more balanced human being. So actually developing my feminine skills as well as the masculine skills, which I've traditionally had from the family background that I have. And so I would argue that we need more empathy. So while maybe the vice president of the US is saying empathy is something we don't need, I would say the opposite. It is something which should be very much part of our leadership and of our way and our humility within that. And that humility, and it's easy for me to talk because it's really difficult when you are a CEO and it's so easy to grab hold of power, is humility actually means creating space within which a conversation is taking place and where decision making is happening in a different way than what we're used to. And so I would encourage that conversation to really happen, and it should be community led. If the changes that are happening today are community led, you can see it happening left, right, and center. And some of it is super exciting to actually see that the power of us as individuals being leaders of ourselves, of our person, is having a profound, or can have a profound effect on the way that we reshape the world in which we live.
Maria, I think that's beautiful. Needless to say, completely and utterly agree. We could encapsulate this as a leadership style that gives room and nurtures empathy and conversation. On a practical side here, I was involved in a coming together of a blended finance instrument in a project in northern Uganda last week, where the investor beautifully had the same thought. We went in and it was completely different to what we thought, because people in the room, which include an NGO, which includes some people in the community. So first of all, I was very pleased that we were successful in getting the right people into the room. And then a completely different problem analysis and way of solving it came around, which actually needed less money. And to finish off, I'm very pleased to say that both the DFI, the Development Finance Institution, as well as the two private investors involved were sort of looking at me over the room and saying, yeah, we're doing this. Okay, that's fine. We can change the program there, and let's do it, because both understood the value of that debate, and they actually asked to have more of these sort of debates. So I think that is exactly what you've just mentioned, Henri. We're running out of time. I was told the magical line is 45 minutes, which we are now spot on. Thank you, everybody, very much for listening to this conversation. If there are questions unanswered, then my colleagues will direct them to Alan, Henri, or myself in the next couple of days by email. Alan, thank you so much for dialing in. Henri, good to see you again. Thank you so much for dialing in. I really appreciated this important and fundamental conversation. I hope everybody here found it useful, and have a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank
Chris.
you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
And thanks everybody for participating.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.